Hey, welcome back. This week, then, we're talking about genetic therapy. So, continuing along the theme of genetic technologies, genetic therapy, the main contrast from, say, genetic screening is that here we're talking about possible ways in which we might more directly intervene or directly alter someone's genetic constitution. So, a lot of the basic ideas are laid out clearly enough in the latter half of that chapter in the Vaughan text. So in particular, the distinction between somatic cell or germline cell therapy. We're going to focus a little bit more on the latter. That has more to do with issues concerning reproduction. It's where there's more controversy, and I guess, well, frankly, the more interesting biomedical questions arise. Somatic cell gene therapy is not so controversial. There's always issues, but we're going to focus a little bit more on the other. And Vaughan also brings up some of the sort of larger idea that is always kind of in the background, while sometimes more in the foreground of these kind of issues, and that's the idea of eugenics. So this will tend to come up in the different readings. Generally, anyone proponents of, say, germline therapy always need to deal with this. The idea of eugenics, it kind of goes back mainly to the earlier decades in the 20th century. People often think about it in connection with the Nazis, and there's a reason for that, but it was not at all just limited to that. There was eugenicists all around the world, including in the United States, basically seeking, pursuing agendas of trying to raise the level of the species or improve the species, typically by trying to weed out, usually and often by very coercive means, often not only along racist lines as well, trying to, fulfill a vision of a better species, basically. It was hugely problematic. Almost everything was wrong about it, basically. And so people today, when they're thinking about, very, modern genetic therapeutic techniques, kind of need to deal with that, need to somehow show that what they're saying isn't like that, it wouldn't involve the same sort of problems that clearly involves. So usually the main difference is just going to be they're going to think that it's something that people can, individually opt or choose to participate in, whereas in the past it was kind of like a coercive, state-imposed measures and so on that were forced upon people. There's an important distinction that's in there between negative and positive eugenics, which has nothing to do with value judgments, the negative and the positive. I mean, negative eugenics is where you're thinking about trying to eliminate certain, say, diseases or, negative conditions, whatever, trying to eliminate something. Positive eugenics is more about trying to actually improve or bring about novel improvements to people's sort of health and, say, particular genetic constitution. That does come up. That will come up in at least some of the readings as well, but just important to have in mind. The negative and positive labels there, they're not judgments, right? All eugenics, at least for some people, is bad. Nowadays, it's just become a new question as to whether we can go about something which is technically the same thing, that is, trying to improve or enhance human beings that wouldn't run afoul of the kinds of problems that we saw in the past. So the first reading from Harris is fairly straightforward. He basically thinks that the difference, because a lot of this has to do or focuses initially on supposed distinction between, on the one hand, just medical treatment kind of in general, and on the other hand, techniques of enhancement. He wants to break that down and say there's actually a pretty smooth continuity between those things, basically, which would mean, interestingly enough, that not only would it be permissible, say morally permissible, to engage in such techniques, that is kind of germline gene therapy, it would actually be mandatory in the same way, at least, or to whatever extent any kind of medical intervention is mandatory. This always assumes, well, A, that such techniques exist, and in this case they actually don't yet, but that they exist, that they are safe, and so on. All of those things are always assumed, and that's okay, basically. He's saying if such techniques were available, then they would be mandatory, basically by the principle of beneficence, in the same way that any kind of doable medical intervention would be mandatory, basically. Now, note how he goes about this. He thinks it's a good thing to do it like this. He kind of takes the two big questions and separates them. So on the one hand, he says, well, is there basically a difference on the one hand? Hang on. Sorry. He basically wants to say there's no essential difference on the one hand, between like genetic therapy and just other medical treatments in general. He thinks, there's nothing particularly special about it. So, and he thinks most people might agree. If you just focus on that question, you might draw that conclusion. And then we turn our attention to the distinction between treatment and enhancement and thinks, well, likewise, if you just focus on that, it's pretty easy to see that, enhancement sort of follows naturally. And he will point out, as others will too, we do things like this. Simply getting a vaccination shot is in effect a kind of enhancement. So, basically things, if you look at those two questions sort of separately, they're both pretty easy to see. Well, then it's just a matter of putting them together. Right? So basically he thinks we can get confused when we try to deal with the two questions simultaneously. When we try at once to think about, well, is genetic therapy acceptable simultaneously with the question, is enhancement acceptable? That's when we kind of get confused, he thinks. If we just separate them out in that way and see, well, each issue on its own is pretty clear, well, that's how he gets to the conclusion that basically, genetic enhancement should be permissible, in fact, mandatory. And in other words, there's no particular objection that should be raised any differently than any other kind of medical treatment. The next one from Glannon, basically, he tries to take, the opposite view. He's trying to argue against the permissibility of enhancement like that, genetic enhancement along those kinds of lines. Now, he's got a bunch of different arguments. He's trying to cover some different cases. His main line, though, is to say that it just would be wrong. It would be unfair, because he's assuming there would be differential access to such techniques. And so if only some people could enhance themselves, or rather enhance their children in this way, that would just lead to situations of unfairness, and so let's just not do it, he says. He can also then back that up saying, well, look, even if the unfairness is not itself such a problem, there would be these kind of wider consequences in terms of the notions of equality and the other kinds of principles that keep society on an even keel. So it would lead to problems like that. So that's an additional reason, even if the unfairness itself wasn't so extreme or problematic. And then you can also add, look, if the unfairness is addressed by equalizing access, in other words, everybody had access to this, everybody could enhance themselves in these ways, well, then it would just be self-defeating. What would be the point, right? If everybody, in other words, if you couldn't gain some kind of advantage, if everybody remained the same, then just why bother? And then he just adds in, look, chances are there's going to be some problems, so if there were equal access, chances are the overall gain from the social perspective would be negative, because some people would suffer some unfortunate, unexpected consequences or so on. And then finally he says, look, even if through enhancement what we focus on are sort of pro-social qualities, in other words, it's not individuals trying to get ahead in some way, but actually sort of socially beneficial qualities, in other words, make people more moral, for example, he thinks, well, that's just kind of weird. I mean, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. That would actually be like programming people to be good, but the whole point of being good, the whole point of wanting to be moral, is that there is, kind of like a challenge, right? It is possible to be bad, and we praise people for choosing to be good, when they sort of had the option to do otherwise. That's kind of the whole point. That's what exercising our autonomy means, for Glannon anyways. And so he thinks, that would just be basically wrong, taking away people's autonomy, in effect, by kind of programming them in a certain way. So he thinks he's kind of covered the ground, whichever way people might choose to defend the permissibility of such genetic enhancement, he thinks it's just not going to pay off. I think, in effect, he doesn't really put it this way here. He's basically saying there's no real problem to be solved through these techniques of genetic enhancement. Right? There's no real problem. I think it's like this. He says if we allow, the research at preliminary stages to go forward, then yeah, probably we could generate a problem, right? We could sort of create a need for this or something and then try to solve it. But why would we do that? We don't need to create the problem, the answer to which is genetic enhancement. Let's just leave well enough alone, I think is his message, and just kind of not go there. The last reading is from Savulescu, basically. So this one is very close to Harris, obviously, kind of going back in the direction of trying to defend the permissibility of genetic enhancement. Making some of the same kind of points, basically breaking down the distinction between, say, treatment and enhancement, basically to show it's just kind of the natural outgrowth of medical science, basically. And, if we have that available, then we really should use it, right? Failure to do so would basically constitute a harm that is ruled out by beneficence. The main difference here, it seems to me, is that he just wants to go a little bit further. So I think if we step back, the other readings, both Harris and Glannon, although they look pretty far apart, they're actually not as far apart as it seems, basically. I mean, they're both kind of focused on health, basically, and doing what it takes. So in particular, Glannon certainly allows for genetic techniques by way of, say, preventative measures and so on, ways of preventing diseases and so on. And I think that is kind of the main thing Harris seems to have in mind, too. So it may look as if they're very far apart, but I think in more concrete terms, there's a lot of agreement there. They're focused on kind of health, dealing with health, basically. Glannon is just a lot more, I think, wary of allowing it to go in the direction of like outright enhancement. But that's the thing that Savulescu, I think, is really emphasizing more clearly than Harris here, just outright enhancement. So he makes the distinction, which is very important, between health and well-being. He basically says, health's not what it's all about. Health is instrumental. We only want health so that we have well-being in our life. So we don't need to just focus on like disease and sickness, actually. There may be other ways we can put medical science to use that would raise our well-being, quite separate from issues directly concerned with health. So in some ways, it's like plastic surgery, basically, right? Thinking this makes people, supposedly, I don't get it, but anyway, people can think that their well-being is increased even though it has no direct connection with their health, strictly understood. All right, so he does seem to it's a very similar conclusion to Harris, but it does seem to have a greater scope, basically, in the fact that it's not really just talking about sort of treatment or even sort of a broadened notion of that, but enhancement as something that is essentially quite different. There's something else similar with Harris, and that is the kind of reasoning which basically says, if we can do something, if we are able to do something, then we must. And that doesn't always, you may or may not agree with that. Not everybody does. I mean, in this case, it's always, a little trickier just because the actual ability is not yet fully there, and we've got to decide now whether we want to take the steps that could lead us to ever having the ability to intervene in these ways in the first place. So anyway, there's that issue, but the same kind of reasoning is there, and as I say, some of that kind of Glannon can be on board with that too when it comes to certain preventative measures anyways. But basically with Savulescu, because he seems to be just open to a wider scope of enhancement, it's very interesting. I won't talk about all the objections, how he replies, but the idea about, so-called, the expression as it goes, playing God, some people think, that there's something inherently wrong about dealing with these things. Most people think, well, no, there's just the risks are just always going to be too high. And he's aware of that, but still seems to think if it were within our ability, to produce enhancements along any kind of lines in human beings, individually and human beings as a species, he thinks we really should. And that's just a very interesting thing to think. Is that really the point? Is that really what the point of science or medical science in particular is for? Should we even, is that an appropriate direction to sort of apply our knowledge and our skills, or is that just, kind of misguided in some way? That's kind of the big interesting question. We can think about positive eugenics. It doesn't have to have terrible connotations. the question just is that even something we're concerned with or we should even be bothered with? So we can talk about something like that in the discussion.